Hello my beautiful watchers, and welcome to Lost in Adaptation, the YouTube-based review show that's all about comparing film adaptations to the books they're based on. I just wanted to start by reminding y'all that there is hours of exclusive content available on my Patreon page, including unhinged book rants, full episodes of Lost in Adaptation that were either taken down due to copyright or made exclusively for Patreon, and additional videos like my thoughts on adaptations that I'm not covering in this video. And a small selection of people can request a book and film that I will then be honor bound to cover, no matter how ungodly long it is. Link up there and down there, it's pretty much everywhere. Before I jump in, I just want to quickly disclaimer that I am really bad at pronouncing French names. I do not parler bien français. I don't know if it's the dyslexia or the being British, but either way, buckle up, this might get a little painful for some of you. So, Thomas Alexandre Dumas was a hugely successful and talented general in the French Revolutionary Army. Grudgingly praised by Napoleon Bonaparte himself, he was at the time the highest-ranking black officer in European history. And keep in mind, this is the army of a country that hasn't even abolished slavery yet. That's how badass he was. Unfortunately, while returning from a campaign in Egypt, General Dumas' ship was captured by enemy forces and he was thrown into a pretty horrific dungeon. Now, every standard of decency, loyalty, and national pride should have obliged the Napoleonic government to negotiate for his release, but, jealous of his success and resentful that he was more Republican than Bonapartist, they decided to abandon the general who had done so much for his country, and he was left to rot in squalor for 2 years. Even worse, upon his eventual return to France, he was stripped of his rank, pension, and all recognition for his accomplishments. Utterly betrayed by his own allies, he died in 1806 and might have been successfully written out of history by his rivals if his 4-year-old son Alexandre hadn't gone on to become one of the most famous and successful authors of the 19th century. Indeed, Alexandre Dumas, party boy, novelist and playwright, author of, amongst other things, The Three Musketeers, The Man in the Iron Mask, and 20 Years After, is considered one of the most influential French writers of all time, often spoken of in the same breath as the likes of Voltaire and Victor Hugo. The younger Dumas would have his own run-ins with Napoleon as the emperor bounced in and out of power. He was pretty outspoken about preferring a republic over an empire, so he had to flee France into self-imposed exile when the little general took over for like the 3rd time. I don't know, the French Revolution had more reboots than DC Comics. So, knowing all this, it's really not that difficult to guess the inspiration for his novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, the story of a great man who was fucked over by the Napoleonic government, betrayed and imprisoned unjustly by what should have been his allies, and went into self-imposed exile, before coming back to absolutely destroy the sons of bitches that ruined his life. So, yeah, I mean, it's legitimate to interpret this as 1,200 pages of author catharsis. It absolutely did not need to be over 1,000 pages, by the way. Dumas was paid by the frickin' word, and oh boy can you tell. He never uses one sentence when he can use 27 and see them francs pile up. Anyways, it was originally published as a serialization in a Parisian newspaper from 1844 to 1846, keeping fans waiting weeks between installments for nearly 2 years. Once completed, it was compiled and sold as a full novel. This is one of those books that has too many adaptations to count, some popular, others doomed to fade into obscurity. Some have even been lost to time or intentionally destroyed over copyright issues. Because there's so many, I've decided to cover 3 examples to see how they compare to each other as well as to the book that inspired them. They were chosen for a combination of Patreon requests and personal choice, not necessarily popularity or success. Right, so I really wanted to give you guys a little info on the goings-on in this book so you'd have a better idea of what I'm talking about when I list what they changed, but, you know, it's thick. I eventually realized it was a lot easier to synopsisize each of the key characters' arcs throughout the book as opposed to trying to condense the whole frickin' thing and all of its many intentional tangents, but even so there is a lot of stuff that I'm going to have to skip over. On the bright side, I have it on good authority that Red from OSP is going to be summarizing this book around the same time as this video goes up, so hopefully she managed to do it more coherently than me, and here's the timecode if you don't need another refresher. For everyone else, the story's protagonist, Edmond Dantes, starts the story as an optimistic young man employed on a French merchant ship called the Pharaon? Here we go. Pharaon, the Pharaon, je l'espère. Anyways, he's on the cusp of achieving all of his life's ambitions at the tender age of 19, as he's about to be made the captain of the Pharaon after the previous died of natural causes, and he's engaged to the prettiest girl in town, Mercedes. All he has to do first is deliver the mysterious letter given to him on the Isle of Elba as per his former captain's dying wish, which of course he does without questioning it whatsoever, despite that being where Napoleon is currently being held prisoner, because he's just that much of a sweet summer child. But alas, a bunch of total douchebags covered his success in the workplace and in love, so they send an anonymous tip to the popos saying that he's a fanatical Bonapartist who's delivering the Emperor in Exile's mail for him. As a result, Dantes is arrested, thrown in prison without trial, and spends all of his 20s in a dungeon while the Napoleonic government rose and fell again while making zero effort to release their supposed agent. So when he finally gets out, he swears revenge on the men who ruined him. One of the first things he does is buy the island of Monte Cristo and make himself the count of it, which will make a lot more sense in just a moment. The Abbé Faria, an abbé is a kind of priest, I believe. Anyway, he's what I can only assume to be a not very subtle parody of Leonardo da Vinci, as he's an elderly, eccentric Italian super genius and inventor. Imprisoned for decades for political reasons as equally fictitious and stupid as Edmond's, he's meticulously built a fully working study in his cell, furnished with ink, paper, tools and candles that he's somehow made from the scraps of food and drink he's been given over the years and small pieces of metal harvested from his bed frame. He accidentally tunnels into Dante's cell while trying to escape the prison and becomes his mentor and father figure, teaching him multiple languages, the sciences, economics and philosophy while they work together to make a tunnel pointing in the right direction this time. Tragically, he dies of what was probably a stroke right before they can escape, but not before telling Dantes the location of an ungodly amount of buried treasure on an island called Monte Cristo that he was hoping they could dig up after their escape. In a twist that I was personally a little incredulous of, Dantes then abandons the tunnel that they'd been working on for literal years and instead escapes by switching himself with the Abbe's body in its shroud and letting the guards toss him into the sea. Dantes then makes his way to the island of Monte Cristo and is surprised to discover that the old man wasn't kidding. There is indeed a fuck ton of gold and jewels there, so he's now one of the richest men in the world, which, as you can imagine, makes seeking revenge a hecking lot easier. The Abbé Faria is by far my favourite character of the entire book. I just wish he'd been in more of it. Moving on to Danglars, the brains and primary instigator behind the plot against Dantes. He's the supercargo on the Pharaon, which is an unnecessarily dramatic word for the accountant. He has a minor altercation with Dantes on their last voyage and resents him being made captain, so he casually hatches a plot to have him falsely imprisoned for the rest of his life. Over the next decade and a half, he becomes mega rich and politically powerful using deeply unethical business practices and gains the title of Baron through marriage. When he comes back all counterfied, Dantes spends a lot of time becoming publicly frenemy-y with Danglars, regularly engaging in subtle battles of wits and sass, and measuring dicks with him via which one of them is wealthier. Dantes eventually bribes a telegraph operator to feed Danglars some fake insider trading info so catastrophically inaccurate it ruins him financially and forces him to flee to Italy with a stolen golden parachute, where he's immediately captured by some famous bandits who owe Dantes a bunch of favors. They extort all of Danglars' remaining money from him and return it to the charities he stole it from. Then, in a twist, Dantes decides to let him live, as this is the final part of his revenge rampage and he's pretty burnt out on it for various reasons. Fernand Mondego is Valentine's Spanish cousin and love rival for her affection. Gross. In order to get rid of the competition, he helps in the plot to frame Dantes, convinces Valentine to settle for him a few years later, and they have a son called Albert. He has a long, seemingly successful career as a soldier, reaching the rank of general. While working as a French attaché to a Greek noble during the Greek War of Independence, he accepts a bribe to betray him to his enemies, assists in his murder, and sells his widow and child into slavery before returning to France, assuming that he'd destroyed all the evidence of this great evil. Not surprisingly, this is the info that Dantes uses to destroy him, pointing a journalist in the right direction to expose it. When he's completely ruined and Valentine and Albert leave him, Mondego suicides by gunshot. Haydée is the just mentioned Greek noble girl that Mondego sold into slavery. She's rescued by the Count of Monte Cristo when she's a teenager and adopted as his daughter, traveling around the world with him and eventually giving a witness statement that doomed Mondego. And then she and Dantes get together at the end. Yeah, middle-aged Dantes pulls a Woody Allen and shacks up with his 20-year-old daughter in the last chapter. What else can I say but yikes? Caderousse is a tailor and petty criminal who was not directly involved in the plot to bring down Dantes, but was kind of an honorary member because he was at the table while it was being hatched, but wasn't contributing because he was absolutely shit-faced. He's actually pretty upset when the fiendish scheme to get Dantes arrested that he hazily recollected from the night before comes to fruition, but is too cowardly to oppose Danglars and expose what he did. His guilty conscience eventually drives him to move to the countryside, where he starts an unsuccessful inn business. Disguised as an abbé, Dante learns how little a role he played in his downfall, so decides not to punish him. In fact, he tries to help him financially and morally several times over the next few years, but Caderousse would always eventually return to his life of crime until he's betrayed and murdered by a comrade. Villefort's an interesting one because he wasn't involved in the original conspiracy, but ends up fucking Dantes over more than anyone else. He's kind of like the detective or prosecutor assigned to Dantes after he's arrested, and he actually wants to help him at first because he fully believes that he's innocent, but at the very last second he realizes that the Bonapartist that the letter was intended for is completely coincidentally his own father. So to cover for daddy and protect his own career, he throws Dantes right under the bus and has him sent to prison with no trial and no chance of appeal. His downfall is by far the most convoluted of the book, as it involves a murder mystery that Dantes kind of knew about but wasn't directly responsible for, and this controversy involving a buried baby that grows up to be a criminal that, like, kind of like Villefort's father's involvement appears to be completely coincidental and unrelated to the Count of Monte Cristo and the current murder spree. I don't know about anyone else, but to me, Villefort's entire story comes off as a long series of insane coincidences. So basically, Villefort's wife poisons almost his entire family one by one for inheritance and crazy person related reasons, and when Villefort eventually catches on, he ultimatums her to poison herself while he goes off to work, which she does, but she also takes their infant son out with them, which makes Dantes regret giving her hints about where to find good poisons. He does manage to save Villefort's daughter Valentine though by faking her death with like coma poison and reuniting her with her secret lover Maximilian, kind of like Romeo and Juliet but with a happy ending. Okay, the baby thing. How do I even explain this? Okay, so the Count of Monte Cristo has a henchman from Corsica, right? And at some point, Dantes decides to buy Villefort's old mansion as part of his quest to show all of Paris he's got the biggest dick in town, and the Corsican starts freaking out because it turns out he tried and failed to murder Villefort in this very garden years before over a completely unrelated personal insult. Right before shanking him, he noticed that Villefort had just buried a chest, which he thought might be full of treasure, so he dug it up, but no, it's actually got a fucking baby in it that Villefort apparently thought was dead, so was burying the evidence of. So the Corsican does emergency CPR on the baby and brings him back to life, and then takes him to his sister to raise, and they call him Benedetto. They try to bring up Benedetto as their own, but the kid turns out to be a complete dickhead, kills the sister, and runs off. Years later, he, once again, completely coincidentally, ends up being Caderousse's cellmate and gets busted out of prison by the Count at the same time as him, and he's the one who eventually ends up killing Caderousse after a failed robbery attempt. Anyways, a shit ton of other stuff happens, and he ends up going on trial for Caderousse's murder in Villefort's court, and takes the opportunity while he's in the spotlight to dramatically reveal that he's the bastard son that the prosecution had tried to literally bury, which understandably puts a bit of a stain on Villefort's reputation. So Villefort has the worst day of his life. He's just found out his wife is a murderer, he thinks both of his children are dead, and he's lost his entire career, so he goes completely mad. Vengeance achieved. Oh, and I should probably mention Morel, who is by far the most fantastical thing in this work of fiction. A millionaire CEO who is kind, generous, and supportive of his employees. My suspension of disbelief is shattered. He's the guy who owns the Pharaon and intended to promote Dantes to her captain before all the shit went down. Then he spends several years appealing the arrest and trying to get his boy out of prison to no avail. Unfortunately, the 14 years that Dantes spent in the dungeon weren't kind to Morel either, as all of his ships end up sinking and he goes bankrupt. It gets so dire he decides to suicide to wash away the dishonor that not paying his loans would bring upon his family. Fortunately, one of the first things that Dantes does with his treasure is disguise himself as one of Morel's creditors, pay off all his debts, and build him an exact copy of the Pharaon, even loaded with all the lost cargo, saving his life and his business. Morel's son Maximilian crosses over from this story into the Villefort plotline by falling in love with Valentine and having an entire book's worth of will they won't they as her parents try to engage her to other people and whatnot. After the Count helps fake Valentine's death, he has to make stop Max from killing himself too a full-time job until he can reunite them on the island of Monte Cristo, Dantes' last act in the book before sailing off into the sunset with his daughter-wife. And that's the basics. Like I said, there's a lot I couldn't include, and every sentence I used in this synopsis represents hundreds of superfluous, flowery words that Dumas used to pad the page count. But anyways, at long last, let's have a look at some of the films that this book inspired. Okay, the first film we're holding up to the book is the 1934 classic. That's the one that V was vibing with so hard in V for Vendetta. It was directed by Roland V. Lee and starred Robert Donat as Dantes, Alyssa Landy as Mercedes, Lewis Calhern as Villefort, Sidney Blackmer as Mondego, Raymond Walburn as Danglars, and O.P. Heggie as the Abbé Faria. Philip Dunn was hired to write the dialogue and later admitted he never got around to reading the book. He just had Roland V. Lee describe it to him, and I mean, come on dude, I read this thing for a YouTube video, you weren't willing to do it for a feature film? As a result, he claims there are only 7 lines of original book dialogue in the film, 3 of which are actually numbers, and I checked and he was wrong. The lines he referenced were not in fact in the book.
The world is mine.
So yeah, if any of the dialogue in the film matched the novel, it was by pure coincidence. Despite this, there is still some Dumas in the final result. In fact, the film starts off reasonably strong. Edmond Dantes, the first mate on the merchant ship Pharaon, on the cusp of achieving all of his life ambitions at the tender age of 19. The captaincy awaits and he's engaged to Mercedes. A guy called Mondego is all jelly of her affection and whatnot, and his friend Danglars is a scummy businessman who thinks Dantes needs taking down a peg. They conspire to frame Dantes as a secret supporter of Napoleon, and the local deputy prosecutor, Villefort, helps send him to prison without trial because he doesn't want anyone to know that his daddy has been a very naughty boy. Poor Edmond ends up in a dungeon for the next 14 years, during which time he meets his next door neighbor, the Abbé Faria, who burrows through the ground between them to say hi and proves to only be a slightly mad Italian genius who's furnished himself with all manner of things from the scraps given to him by the guards. They team up to try to escape, but just before their tunnel is completed, the Abbé dies, telling his young friend about a shit ton of buried treasure on an island called Monte Cristo with his last breath. Making the last-minute decision to implement a completely different escape plan, Dantes hides himself in his friend's body bag and is thrown into the sea, where he escapes and swims to a passing smuggler's ship where he's immediately recruited. Making his way to Monte Cristo, Dantes finds the buried treasure there and instantly becomes the richest man in Europe. During all this time, the men who had condemned him to such a sad fate had flourished. Danglars is now rich as heck, Villefort is a powerful magistrate, and Fernand Mondego has talked Mercedes into marrying him and had a son with her. But armed with what is effectively infinite resources, Dantes uses extreme cunning and manipulation to work his way into his enemies' lives under the guise of the Count of Monte Cristo, a title he purchased along with the island itself, and arranges the financial ruin and public disgrace of all 3 of them, gaining a measure of revenge and justice. True to the book, Mercedes is the only person who recognizes Dantes so many years later, though it's handled differently. In the book, it's revealed quite a ways in that she's known the whole time but didn't let on, but in the film they basically acknowledge it right away using barely concealed metaphor talk. Napoleon Bonaparte, referenced so often in the book but not directly appearing in the story, gets a little cameo at the beginning. Aw, that's nice for the little guy. The little guy. Anyways, so the reason I got a little vague towards the end there is the format of Dante's revenge gets all mixed up in the film. He does take Mondego down by outing his past sins, but does it through what appears to be a Hamlet-inspired performance art. They also added Dante's sneaking into Mondego's bedroom after his ruination so they could have an admittedly pretty badass sword fight before Mondego buggers off to eat a pistol off-screen. Haidee makes a quick cameo, but does not appear to be the Count's adopted daughter or his lover. This isn't huge, but it struck me that the film version of Dantes was a bit more into dramatically revealing his identity to all three of his targets at the exact moment of their defeat. I feel like he was significantly more cagey about ever revealing his true name in the book. A much bigger change they went with here is Dantes and Mercedes getting back together at the end. I know that might seem like a logical conclusion, but this was never really a credible option in the book, even after Mondego's death. Her relationship with Dantes ultimately being a tragedy is a pretty integral part of the story. Regarding the other villains of the piece, Camarus is completely omitted, and the leader of the Anti-Edmond League is notably shifted from Danglars to Villefort, who's now involved right from the conception of the plan. They kept the plot twist that the real guilty party was Villefort's father, but it's no longer necessary for the story to advance, and both the murder wife and buried baby Benedetto plots are completely dropped from his story. Danglars is portrayed as a bumbling idiot, easily destroyed almost as an afterthought by Dantes, whereas Villefort is promoted to the final boss of the movie. The film played down the moral complexities of the book considerably, even going as far as to legitimize Dante's revenge spree by having him literally defend it in court and win. His true identity is revealed, and Villefort attempts to have him thrown back in prison, but inspired by Mercedes, Dantes somehow manages to put the prosecution on trial and makes such a rousing speech that I guess he gets a full pardon, because French courts work on an applaudometer, but also the wheelie witness stand, the wheelie witness stand is fucking killing me. Is that thing real? What the fuck is happening in this scene? The film then crowbars in a more traditionally happy ending to the story by, as I said, having Dantes and Mercedes get back together with the blessing of her son. It's all wrapped up in a neat little package that never once questions if Dantes lost the moral high ground along his path to revenge. In general, the film does its best to rid the already pretty innocent Mercedes of any responsibility for her actions post Dantes' arrest, adding in her mother emotionally blackmailing her into marrying Mondego on her deathbed. Final thoughts? So, I guess I would say the key structure remained intact, but with far fewer subplots and very simplified characters and morals. This film really leans into painting Dantes as a clear-cut hero wronged by corrupt men and fully justified in striking back at them. It's not particularly surprising though, as 1934 was the first year that Hollywood started rigidly enforcing the notorious Hays Code, the strict censorship guidelines that prohibited ethical grey areas from being portrayed in films. So, yeah, the fearless adventure hero defeating his evil foes would have been a perfect tone for some of Dumas' other work, like The Three Musketeers, but this particular book was one of his more complex, so the film only bears a moderate similarity to it. However, for what it's worth, I personally think there's a charm to it that makes up for a lot of its failures as an adaptation. Next, we jump ahead a few decades to 1975. Apparently, producer Norman Rosemount originally pitched this as a miniseries, but eventually made a deal with NBC to make it into a TV movie with a limited theatrical release in some parts of Europe. He was given a $1.5 million budget to work with, which was pretty small but not insanely so in 1970s money. With this cash, he hired Kevin Reynolds to direct, Richard Chamberlain as Dantes, Kate Nelligan as Mercedes, Louis Jordan as Villefort, Tony Curtis as Mondego, Donald Pleasance as Danglars, and Trevor Howard as the Abbé. I've got to say, a recurring theme in this and the next adaptation is the lack of consistent logic regarding who has a French accent and who doesn't. I feel like if the cast is non-diegetically speaking English, then either everyone should have an accent or none of them should. Anyways. Okay, second verse is actually pretty similar to the first. The film accurately started with Dantes as the acting captain, covered Mercedes, the conspiracy to undo him, Villefort almost helping him but then helping himself and his dad instead, Dantes' 14-year imprisonment, the Abbé F and their escape attempt followed by Ferria's tragic death and Dantes' actual escape in his shroud. His smuggler saviors, the treasure, setting himself up as the Count, getting in good with his foes, financially ruining Danglars, outing Mondego as a complete fuckhead who did a slavery, and arranging for Villefort to be ruined mid-court session when everyone realizes that the defendant is his biological son, who he buried alive at one point. This version remembers to mention that Mondego is Spanish and Mercedes' cousin. Gross. Benedetto's weird origin is relatively accurate to the book, minus the Corsicans' involvement. However, it's not set up in advance like it was in the novel, so the information that Villefort once buried a baby alive comes completely out of nowhere at the end. Dantes' father actually gets enough screen time for the audience to be pretty bummed that he starved to death while his son was in prison, a primary driving force behind his son's fury. The film doesn't explicitly include the 10-year gap between when Dantes found his treasure and when he actually puts his revenge plans into place, but it is pretty heavily implied with him suddenly being a silver fox and having a whole retinue in tow. Caderousse is promoted to a full-fledged sober participant in the plot against Dantes. He actually has a motive now, as in this version he was a crew member on the Pharaon and Dantes was forced to punish him for petty theft. Benedetto's role is in the same ballpark as the book, becoming an unwitting tool of the Count, but they changed a metric ton of details. Dantes takes a much less subtle approach in using him as an instrument of revenge, intentionally putting him in the path of Caderousse, who he apparently has bad blood with in this version, so they'd fight to the death. He then sneaks into the prison and coaches Benedetto in exactly what to say in court regarding his paternal plot twist. I'm not sure how I feel about him being set up to murder Caderousse so early on in the movie. Book Dantes was very clear on the subject of killing his enemies. He could have done that at any time once he was out of prison. He spoke at length about how he didn't want them to have the easy out of a quick death. He wanted to utterly destroy them the way they destroyed him. Danglars is restored to his position as the guy who actually came up with the plan to get Dantes sent to prison, but he still takes a relatively backseat villain of the story-wise, not playing a role as anything other than an easily manipulated investor. He's the third man to be brought down instead of the last, and in this version, he's the one who blows his own brains out after his fall. Richard Chamberlain claims that he avoided watching any of the preceding movies so that he wouldn't be influenced by other actors, but I strongly suspect that not everyone involved had the same restraint, because I see a lot of the 1934 film's influence on this adaptation. Dantes and Mondego resolving their differences with a sword fight for one thing, and he and Albert Alexander Hamiltoning their shots in the duel instead of just calling the whole thing off before it happened, like in the book. You know, I should probably test the terms that I make up for pronounceability before I try and put them in a script. The Italian bandits are one of the many subplots skipped over, both their role in the main story and the colossal tangent that Dumas went on describing the rich history of several notable gang members. Young Miss Valentine got a cameo early on, raising my hopes of seeing the Villefort murder mystery subplot, but alas, she left as quickly as she came. It was nice to see her paralyzed grandfather included in the movie, even if he didn't get to do any of the badass stuff that he did in the novel. Honestly, the book might be worth reading just to see how this absolute G constantly protected his granddaughter even though all he could do was blink. Haydée gets a more involved role than she did in 1934, but the Count still did not shag her at the end. Once again, Dantes makes no move to save his old boss and friend Morel from destitution, or any of the other acts of kindness that he performs in the book. The film relies on the audience's automatic instinct to root for the protagonist and feel sympathy for the injured party to make him in any way likable. This film does slightly better at remembering that the book was not 100% in favor of vengeance quests, albeit in its own unique way. Dantes seems keen to get back together with Mercedes at the end, but this time is turned down on the grounds that he's nothing like the man she fell in love with anymore, leaving him victorious but sad and alone right before the credits roll. Final thoughts. Again, This is definitely a step up in book accuracy overall, but it's interesting to me that it followed in the 1934 film's footsteps regarding adhering to the original plot for the frame job, imprisonment, escape, and financially ruining Danglars, but added a sword fight between Dantes and Mondego and quietly ignoring all the complicated nonsense regarding Villefort's shitshow of a home life. While I'm glad that Caderousse was included in some capacity, he's got nothing in common with his book counterpart. He and his honestly pretty fucking lit eyeliner represent an entirely new direction in the story. I have to admit, I feel the opposite way about this film than the last. There's a ineffable awkwardness to this movie that makes it difficult for me to watch, even though it's objectively the better adaptation. And finally, 2002, directed by Kevin Reynolds of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves fame. You know, in hindsight, that resume alone should have prepared me for his level of interest in accuracy to the source material. According to Reynolds, his reason for making this film was literally, sure, why not? Which is an attitude he evidently brought into a lot of adaptation-related decisions. This time around we got Jim Caviezel as Dantes, Dagmara Dominčík as Mercedes, I'm sorry if that's way off, James Frann as Villefort, Guy Pearce as Mondego, Albie Woodington as Danglars, Richard Harris as the Abbé. I'm sure we all remember where we know him from, we just don't talk about that anymore. And they're joined by a teeny tiny baby version of Henry Cavill playing Albert Mondego. It was made on a budget of $35 million, which again is on the low side but not insanely so. So, let's see how the first Monte Cristo adaptation of the 21st century holds up compared to the ones in the last millennium. No, I can do this. It might take some vague wording to slip some of these plot points past a lie detector, but I got this. Dantes goes to Elba, where he gets a letter. Danglars and Mondego do a snitch on him. Villefort almost helps him out, but chucks him in the slammer as soon as he hears Daddy Villefort's name. The Abbé Faria breaks into his cell to teach him some mad knowledge. They spend literal years digging a tunnel, only for Dantes to eventually escape by pretending to be his friend's body. He gets himself some sick loot and uses it to get revenge. Now, this might have sounded about equal to the other two films. However, everything, even when it's something from the book, is cranked up to 11 in this. Dantes isn't just thrown into the sea, he's thrown into the sea just in time before he's rumbled, and he takes the fucking warden down with him and fucking drowns him. When the Count makes his big appearance in Parisian society, he arrives in an acrobat-filled hot air balloon that, now that I look closely at it, doesn't appear to have a flame powering it. I guess he discovered helium on his travels. The Abbé doesn't just teach Dantes economics like an old nerd, now he's an ex-soldier as well as a priest and trains him in the art of sword and knife fighting, which is useful because this film doesn't just add a sword fight between him and Mondego, no. Now he fights him multiple times, and he fights a company of British soldiers, and fights to win a place with these smugglers he teams up with, and he fights Danglars when he resists arrest. He's basically a swashbuckling action hero now. Speaking of Mondego, in this interpretation, he and Dantes start the story as childhood friends and shipmates, making his betrayal of him a much more personal event and solidifying him as the main villain of the story. In one of the many additional action scenes, Dantes actually briefly escapes from the French soldiers after he's been arrested and goes to Mondego for help, which gives the sneaky bastard the chance to do an evil "it was me all along" speech. Danglars is once again relegated to the least relevant of Dantes' enemies. He's now an ineffective officer on the Charon and only moderately successful in his business endeavors after the time jump. Dantes ruins him overnight by baiting him into attempting to steal his treasure chests, then summoning the fuzz to catch him in the act. This film also elected to drop the Haiti plot, the Villefort family murders, and Benedetto completely, instead creating an entirely original plot twist that Villefort had conspired with Mondego to assassinate his inconvenient Bonapartist father. Caderousse is once again omitted. His lack of impact on the main revenge plot makes him just too tempting a target for the cutting room floor. I feel like this film actually drew attention to the fact that Dantes does nothing to help morale by including a scene where he sees him in financial destitution, realizes the old man doesn't recognize him anymore, and then just leaves him to it, I guess. Okay, get this, alright? Dantes and Mondego actually meet Napoleon Bonaparte in this film. They stop at Elba to try and get medical help for their dying captain, get into a misunderstanding fight with his jailers, and end up being hosted by the Emperor of France himself, who personally puts the fateful letter into Dantes' pocket. While this is deeply amusing on several levels, I have to say it robs me of a lot of the sympathy I had for Dantes. Please, sir, I had no idea I was a part of a plot to free Napoleon. I just agreed to smuggle a letter written by and handed to me by Napoleon. Like, bro, you accepted a pinky promise that he wasn't up to no good from the man who betrayed the entire country of Spain. A decade and a half in prison would be a fitting punishment if naivete was a crime. While Mondego's dark past in Greece with Hades omitted, they played up him being a complete bastard in every other way. Cheating on his wife, killing men in duels, gambling, general criming. Whatever nuance he might have had at the start of the film is thrown out of the window pretty fast in exchange for a two-dimensional, mustache-twirling villain, ripe for being killed in a cinematic sword fight at the end. Interestingly, the 1934 version also replaced the Abbé's final fatal illness with a Rocks Fall, Ferriera dies scenario, so this film is not completely wild for doing it too. This incarnation of Dantes can't read, which I think was added to explain his failure to check Napoleon's letter before trying to deliver it, but one has to wonder how he became an officer on a ship without this ability. There's like logs and shit to fill out, right? This film takes the getting back with Mercedes plot point and raises it an additional final twist, that Cavalbert was actually Dantes' son, conceived right before he was thrown in jail. I thought they might have been setting up the revenge is bad actually moral when the Abbé begs Dantes to use the treasure for good with his final breaths, but Dantes is like, nah dog, I'ma use that shit for vengeance, and once again his revenge is portrayed as a good and just thing. Amusingly, after everyone is dead or in prison, then Dantes tries to promise the Abbé's ghost that he'll obey his last wish and use his money for good. Like, I mean, yeah, it's pretty fucking easy to promise no more revenge when you've already done all the revenge you wanted to do. That's not what the Abbé meant, and you know it, you cake-having and eating it motherfucker. Final thoughts. A third one. Well, here I was worried that I'd end up repeating the same observations about every adaptation on this list, but that is definitely not an issue with this bad boy. The writers of this film were clearly more interested in making something that would be entertaining to a 2002 audience than they were in staying loyal to Dumas' book. This is the Count of Monte Cristo if Dumas had access to limitless cocaine. You can see the original story in there, buried underneath all the white powder, but it's not even an attempt at a loyal adaptation. They wanted to make a more modern, action-packed, satisfying version of the story, and they succeeded. Whether or not you enjoy that or find it cringe as hell is a personal preference, I guess. Final thoughts about the entire thing. Every film either vastly simplified how Dante originally got his revenge or replaced the plan entirely with something new and streamlined. The available runtime of a watchable film made that pretty much inevitable, and I have to admit, as a result they tend to be less convoluted and don't require me to suspend my disbelief quite as hard regarding the Count of Monte Cristo's apparent omniscient levels of knowledge and influence. Amusingly, each film seems to have played a game of roulette to decide which conspirator to play up as the main villain of the piece, and which one ends up dead at the end, but they all consistently downplayed Danglars' role despite him being the OG ringleader in the book. And it's not hard to see why all of the other conspirators have more interesting motivations, be it love, protecting their status, or their family members. But that misses the point. Danglars having the least beef with Dantes was a feature, not a bug. It's supposed to be chilling just how nonchalantly Danglars utterly destroys a person who's mildly annoyed him, casually writing a note that would take away a promising young man's future in a bar over a couple of drinks. His lack of relatable motivation is what made him the worst of the book's villains. Leaving out the Villefort household murders seems logical from a storytelling perspective and inevitable from a practical standpoint. It's a time-consuming sub-arc that goes on without the lead's involvement for like 99% of the book. But it's a shame because it was an excellent example of the moral complexities of the book and an essential part of its themes regarding regarding the danger of pursuing revenge. Dantes was as surprised to find out that Villefort's wife was locked and loaded to kill all her in-laws as the reader was, and believed that this gift-wrapped tool of his vengeance was a sign that God and fate were endorsing his goals, therefore making him guiltless in the deaths that she incurred, even though it was him who subtly encouraged them and did nothing to stop it despite knowing what was going on from the start. But the death of Villefort's young son, not part of the Count's plan, makes Dantes realize that he's gone too far, that it's not divine providence or destiny punishing his enemies, it's him, and regardless of his justification, he is in fact morally responsible for his actions. This ties into what, in my opinion, is the biggest mistake that all three adaptations make, and the reason they fall short of the novel. And that, my beautiful watchers, is the omission of the genuinely good deeds that Dantes performs. Not the fake ones that contributed to his revenge plots, the ones he had nothing to gain from or reason to do besides being a decent human being deep down. The biggest examples were the multiple slaves that he freed, including Haydée, saving Morel from destitution and suicide, Valentine from her stepmother's poison, Maxwell from following his beloved into her grave, and the multiple times that he tried to help Caderousse get out of his life of crime. His final choice to stop punishing Danglars after only robbing him of his money is important too. He could so easily have killed him or paid the bandits to lock him away for his own 14-year stint in a dungeon, but he ultimately chose to forgive like a good little Catholic and walked away from his revenge right before he finished it. All three films relied on the satisfaction of a revenge story to please its audience, but that's ultimately not what the book was about. At the end of the day, the Count of Monte Cristo novel is not a story about the glory of righteous vengeance, but a cautionary tale about how hatred and revenge can turn a good man cruel. It endorses the idiom, when seeking revenge, dig two graves. Dantes comes within inches of his story ending with him taking his own life, empty and alone now that his goals were complete and he had to sit with all the damage he'd done in the process, and it's only the good deeds that he'd instinctively done along the way that saved him from that. Maximilian, Valentine and Haydée, the three people he helped, literally talk him into going on living, though let's not think too hard about how Haydée went about doing that. Both the 1934 and 2002 versions ended with Dantes' revenge resulting in him achieving inner peace and restoring the life and happiness he should have had with Mercedes. The 1975 version came the closest to the book's moral, ending on a downer as Dantes watches what he could have had sail away from him, so I guess it takes the prize for best adaptation of the three, but it still completely left out the part about how kind acts can ultimately save you, which I think is equally important. So that's the root of it. Dumas understood the satisfaction of revenge, but also knew what a corrupting, destructive force it is, and understood the infinite value of acts of selfless kindness, and none of the films that I watched recreated that understanding. Also, not for nothing, but I would watch the shit out of a spin-off movie about the adventures of a young Abbe Ferreira, running around the late 18th century doing mad scientist shit. Dantes could not have done any of the cool stuff he did without a teacher like him, and while we cannot all, alas, count on a slightly mad Italian genius to bust into our cell and teach us badassery, we can learn it from Skillshare. Skillshare is an online community with thousands of in-depth and informative classes. There's options for hobbyists, professionals, and everyone in between. Designed and presented by illustrators, designers, developers, photographers, content creators, and marketers, just to name a few. A lot of people reach out to me for advice about writing and publishing, which has always been a little confusing to me because I'm not a published author. Fortunately, Sabah Tahir, Daniel Jose Older, and Myla Goldberg are successful authors, and they all have classes available on Skillshare about tips on writing authentic fiction, creative writing bootcamps, and storytelling 101 lessons. There's also dozens of classes available about the path to publishing your work, be it traditional publishers, self-publishing, ebook, or journalistic. These lessons have been extremely helpful to me by showing me what qualities to look for when reviewing works of fiction, and would be an invaluable resource for people looking to create it. Skillshare has also been fueling my obsessive hobbies recently, with guides on 3D sculpting for my printer and a beginner's guide to blacksmithing because, yes, for some reason I am a weirdo who likes my free time to be as hot and physically demanding as possible. The first 500 people to use my link in the description or scan the QR code will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so they can get started improving their skills or learning a whole new one from scratch.